Mr. Nobody by Roger Hargreaves. Hello! Meet Mr. Happy. Happy by name and happy by nature. That's Mr. Happy. And now I'm going to tell you a story. Actually, this story isn't about Mr. Happy. Well, not really. It's about somebody he met. It all happened not very long ago. Last month, in fact. Mr. Happy had been to tea with little Miss Sunshine. She was a good friend. "Goodbye," she said to him as she stood in the doorway of Rainbow Cottage. That's where she lives. "See you again soon," she said. "Goodbye," said Mr. Happy, rubbing his tummy. "Thanks for a lovely tea." And off he went. Mr. Happy lives about a mile from Rainbow Cottage. He thought about catching a bus to take him home, but as it was such a lovely day, he thought again and decided to walk. And he was glad he did. Would you like to know why? I shan't tell you. Not yet, anyway. Mr. Happy was whistling to himself as he walked along, when he heard a noise. He stopped. There it was again. A sort of sniffing noise. Sniff, sniff, sniff. Where was it coming from? Suddenly, a drop of rain splashed on the top of his head. "That's odd," he thought to himself, looking up. "There isn't a cloud in the sky." And then, he couldn't believe his eyes. You'll never guess what he saw. No, of course you won't, unless I tell you. So I will. There, sitting on the branch of a tree, was somebody who sort of was, but wasn't. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. You could see through him. I'll say that again, slowly. You could see through him. Really. And he was crying. Real big, fat, wet tears, which of course were what had splashed on top of Mr. Happy's head. Mr. Happy tried to say something, but he was so amazed he couldn't. He tried again. He opened his mouth. "Who," he managed to splutter, "are you?" The person who sort of was, but wasn't, looked mournfully down at him, and, after a long pause, he spoke, in a mournful, melancholy sort of a voice. "Nobody," he said. "Nobody?" gasped Mr. Happy. "Nobody," came the mournful reply. "I'm Mr. Nobody at all." "But everybody's somebody," exclaimed Mr. Happy. The person who sort of was, but wasn't, sighed deeply. "Except me," he said, and he started to cry again. More real, big, fat, wet tears. "What are you doing up a tree?" asked Mr. Happy. "Nothing," he sobbed. "Mr. Nobody, up a tree, doing nothing." Mr. Happy just didn't know what to do. He scratched his head, which was getting quite wet by this time. "Can you get down?" he asked. "Possibly," said Mr. Nobody, and he climbed down out of the tree. "Now," said Mr. Happy, "where have you come from?" "Nowhere," came the sad reply. "Mr. Nobody, from nowhere at all." He sighed again, the sort of sigh that breaks your heart. "I know I used to be somebody, but I can't remember who," he sniffed. "Or what," he sniffed. "Or where," he sniffed. "Or when," he sobbed. Mr. Happy couldn't help but stare. It isn't often that you meet somebody you can see right through. Oh dear! What was he to do? "I think," Mr. Happy said, "that you had better come home with me." "Why?" sobbed Mr. Nobody. "Because," said Mr. Happy, "we must do something about you." "There's nothing that can be done about a nobody," wept the person who was, but wasn't. "Of course there is," said Mr. Happy. "Follow me." And off he set. Mr. Happy looked back. The nobody, who came from nowhere and did nothing, was trailing slowly and miserably along behind him. Eventually they reached Mr. Happy's house. Mr. Happy opened his front door. "After you," he said cheerfully. "You can't go after a nobody," came the muttered reply. The person who was went into his kitchen. "What you need," he said, "is something to eat." "Nobodies don't eat nothing," replied the person who was, but wasn't. "Or a drink," suggested Mr. Happy. "Nobodies don't drink nothing," sighed Mr. Nobody. Mr. Happy was finding this all very depressing, I can tell you, as I've just told you. They went into Mr. Happy's living room. Mr. Happy pointed to a chair. "Sit yourself down," he said. It really was quite extraordinarily extraordinary seeing somebody who was nobody sitting in a chair. Mr. Happy could see him, but Mr. Happy could see the chair as well. Mr. Happy sat down too, and thought hard. Suddenly Mr. Happy snapped his fingers. "I wish I could do that," muttered Mr. Nobody gloomily. "The wizard!" cried Mr. Happy. "Of course, Wizard Prang. I think he's Chinese, but you never quite know with wizards, do you?" So The following morning, after no breakfast, Mr. Happy took Mr. Nobody to see Wizard Prang. After a very, very long walk, they arrived. "Ah!" remarked Wizard Prang after Mr. Happy had tried to explain. "Ah!" he said again, eyeing Mr. Nobody. Mr. Nobody just stood there, looking as glum as anyone can look. Just try turning the corners of your mouth down as far as they will go. Go on. Well, that's about half as glum as Mr. Nobody looked. Wizard Prang thought and thought, and thought some more. "Care for a cup of coffee?" he inquired. "Nobody's don't drink nothing," replied Mr. Nobody. "Nobody's don't drink anything," said Wizard Prang, correcting him. "That's right," agreed Mr. Nobody. "Aha!" cried the wizard in great excitement. "That's it! That is it! If nobodies don't drink anything, then they must drink something." Wizard Prang rushed over to his workbench and started to mix up lots of different coloured liquids together in a huge bottle. They bubbled and gurgled together and let off little puffs of white smoke. Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff! Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff! Mr. Happy had never seen Wizard Prang so excited. The wizard looked over his shoulder. "What colour would you like to be?" he asked. "Nobody's aren't coloured," came the sad reply. "You choose," said the wizard, pointing at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy thought. "Well," he said, "I've always really rather quite enjoyed being yellow." "Yellow it shall be!" shouted Wizard Prang, as he poured more liquid into the bottle. Suddenly, with one huge puff of white smoke, the liquid turned bright yellow. "Right!" cried the wizard. "Drink that!" "Nobody's don't drink nothing," said Mr. Nobody. "Exactly!" shouted Wizard Prang at the top of his voice. "Nobody's don't drink nothing! Therefore, my half-invisible friend, nobody's must drink something!" Mr. Nobody took hold of the bottle and took a small sip. "More!" cried the wizard. "Much more!" "It won't work," sighed Mr. Nobody. But he shut his eyes and took a deep breath and swallowed the whole bottle. Mr. Happy and Wizard Prang watched and waited, and waited and watched. Nothing happened. "Told you so," said Mr. Nobody. And he sighed another of those sighs that break your heart. But wait a minute. Did their eyes deceive them? Or they looked at Mr. Nobody's feet. They were turning sort of, yes, yellow. Yes, decidedly yellow. Definitely yellow. Then Mr. Nobody's legs turned yellow, and then his body, and then his arms. His nose! Mr. Happy shouted. What about his nose? They watched and they waited, and they waited and they watched. Nothing happened. Suddenly, Mr. Nobody sneezed, and immediately after he sneezed, with an enormous pop! Ah, tissue pop! His nose turned yellow as well. Mr. Nobody still just stood there. Look in the mirror, smiled Wizard Prang. So he did. Is that me? Mr. Nobody asked. Yes, 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 shouted Mr. Happy and the Wizard together. That is you! Oh, I wish you'd been there to see Mr. Nobody's face. His mouth stopped turning down and started turning up, and up, and up, and up, and up again. Wizard Prang walked over to Mr. Nobody and clapped him on the back. He couldn't have done that 10 minutes ago, could he? Well, chuckled the wizard. It worked! I've turned a nobody into a somebody! Mr. Happy laughed out loud. Come on, Mr. Somebody, he said. I'll buy you lunch. And he did. Thank you for listening.